So good to see everybody here today. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Rod, and I have the privilege of leading in this church, Livestream South Perth. Welcome to our church. It's great that you're all here. Fantastic to see familiar faces and a wonderful turnout for what's going to be a great afternoon with Keith. And so I just want to extend my welcome. I'm going to hand over to Neil. So hand over to Neil. Neil is the principal of ACOM. So he is top dog for ACOM. And we are absolutely privileged to have him across from Melbourne. And so, mate, you come up and do what you need to do.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. Thanks, everyone. Hey, it's really good to have you all here today, and I'm super excited about this. We've had a few of these seminars and book launches for Keith. Some we've backed onto the end of, one of them we backed on the end of Partners in Ministry seminar in Brisbane. One, Keith had to zoom in because he got COVID, and so that worked out fine as well. And we did another one in Melbourne, so it's great to be here. And I'm loving being back here in Perth. 7 years at Thornley Church of Christ was great. I lobbed here with a 7-month-old, and I now have a 27-year-old. So that was a fair while ago. But I was thinking about 19 years ago or so, I found myself in a car with Keith and with Paul Cameron. Some of you may know him. He was one of the executive ministry leaders in Vic Tas for a time, quite a long time. And Keith and Paul and I were in Tasmania to launch, in a car, driving to Sheffield to launch ACOM in Tasmania. And Keith was just finishing up at the college, and we were asking him, "What are you thinking about doing?" And he goes, "Well, I'm thinking that maybe I might get into a little bit of mentoring. Maybe that seems like I've got a couple of people I've been mentoring, and that I might lean in there. And the other thing is, I'm thinking about reading a book, but I'm not sure that anyone would read it." And Paul and I just looked. I was in the back seat and he was driving, and we looked at each other in the rear vision mirror and just went, "Really?" And we both said at once, "Well, we'll read it." And so here we are, like 20 years later, and Keith's book's here, and we're going to be looking at that later as far as the book launch is concerned. But it is absolute privilege for me as principal at the moment of ACOM to welcome and introduce Keith as one of my, it was my principal for both my degrees, and for some of you in the room it was your principal as well. So Keith, thank you, and we look forward to what it is you've got to say to us this afternoon. Cheers. Thank you. Where are you going to go up there, or do you want this down? What do you want to do?
Maybe a chair just down here would be great. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I reckon we'll put them down.
Okay, thank you, Neil. Thanks to ACOM for the opportunity, and Churches of Christ in WA, and to Livestreams. I'm really grateful for the opportunity not only to be back here after 2 or 3 years of not being able to come, but also to share with you about something that, as you might gather, is passionate in my heart at the moment. Going deep, incidentally, I've got an hour, and then there'll be 25 minutes of questions. So Neil's going to keep me to the hour. I think the questions may well be as valuable as any other part. But I want to share with you on basically the journey of the book, and it's also my own personal journey, going deeper to go further. The book originally, this specific book arose out of my mentoring of Christian leaders over the last 17 and a half years primarily, or that's the way it seems. It's actually primarily out of my biblical understandings of what discipleship is and what leadership is. And it's also significantly about my own journey both as a leader and as a mentor of leaders. Going deeper to go further was not the original intention of the book. The original intention came out of recognising that an uncomfortable percentage of the leaders whom I was alongside mentoring were having, to some extent, significant difficulty with running out of emotional resources, or what we might now call burnout. That quite surprised me when I was alongside leaders. It shouldn't have, because I'd had a burnout experience myself. Mind you, it was so long ago that I didn't know what to call it, and I'm not sure that even psychologists knew what to call it in those days. But now I know very clearly, it was when I was ministering in Melbourne, I ran out of emotional resources and had to take some time away from ministry and needed some professional counselling help myself. That was rather embarrassing at the time, and if you didn't know about that, that's probably because I tried to keep it quiet for at least two reasons. One was that I was teaching in the area of practical ministry and pastoral care at what was then the National College of Churches of Christ in Melbourne. So I'm supposed to be the expert in these areas, and I burn out. The other reason is that I'd actually just within a month of that time, I'd become a registered psychologist. So again, I'm supposed to be the person who understands these issues. Mind you, I never practiced as a psychologist, but I had registration for about 30 years, and it snuck up on me so gradually, in a sense, and surreptitiously, that I didn't know what to call it, and I was very embarrassed about it. But I can say to you that it was probably the deepest learning experience of my life, and the major learning out of that experience was go deeper or you have no future in ministry. And when I was burnt out, I felt I had no future in ministry. So when I was mentoring with people and finding that, along with a lot of other pressures, because Christian leadership and Christian ministry today is much more complicated, much more demanding than it was when I first started, and I'll expand on that a little bit later. Recognising that the demands on Christian leaders, and particularly those in local church ministry, but not only, are at a level that I would say is more stressful and more demanding than ever before, and actually becoming more and more stressful and demanding right at this very time. The word that the people whom I'm with use regularly about the demands on Christian leaders, and particularly those in pastoral ministry, is relentless. It's relentless. So the book set out to be about how to help people to know that the early signs of emotional depletion, help them to stand back from the fence at the top of the cliff so they don't go over, and provide some resources for recuperation, healing and health. The further I got into it, and I had the help of a lady from ACOM, Sarah Whitehead, and if you see her name on the book as the editor, she was much more than that. I just couldn't persuade her to put her name alongside mine. She kept saying to me, "This is your book. You write it. I'll put it in the right kind of sequencing and make it readable," which was a great gift, I believe. Sarah helped me to see that actually burnout's just a symptom. It's not the real problem. It's indicative of the fact that somewhere along the line, either the resources and or the support and or the accountability for the role of being a Christian leader in Australia today are not sufficient. And that more is needed, otherwise there will be a tsunami of people, and I think, unfortunately, we may still be heading towards that tsunami. I'm actually quite hopeful. So I'm going to talk to you about bad news for a little while, but I want you to keep your head up because there's lots of green shoots, as you will see in the last chapter of the book, and there are more green shoots today than when I wrote that last chapter. So I'm actually quite hopeful that from a combination of reasons and thrusts, we're at least turning the corner and potentially have already turned the corner. And I think some of the statistics and the research data from, say, National Church Life Survey are beginning to show that. So don't get too down as I talk about the context in which these symptoms of burnout and emotional depletion became and are evident. Let me take just 5 minutes or so and I'm going to rattle through this. And if you want to challenge or try and see if I've got chapter and verse for what I'm going to say, then you'd be welcome to do that during question time. I'm not going to give chapter and verse. I'm just going to rattle through and then we can come back to anything that you feel I haven't substantiated or you would like to know more about. The dilemmas for leadership and for Christian ministry today begin with, but don't end, and it's not the most important part, with the whole idea of the context of Australia and probably the Western world, where Christianity is definitely on the wane. The tide is going out. It's still going out in Australia, although, again, I see in more recent or most recent documentation from Christian Research Association, National Church Life Survey, other sources, McCrindle and so forth, that there do seem to be some stats, some KPIs that indicate that we're at least holding our own in terms of, say, the percentage of Australian people who claim to be Christian. I'm not sure that we're holding our own in terms of church attendance, and of course COVID has completely, and I understand it's been a bit different here in WA from over in the east, because over in the east it's been very, very difficult. I think it's probably been very difficult here for Christian leaders, but over in the east, as I meet with leaders day by day, they're worse than tired, they're worse than bemused. The changes and the dilemmas, you know, who's coming back to church, whatever, is the events-driven model of church a goner, as indicated by the fact that, you know, the whole model was a truck was driven through it by COVID, etc. So it's been a major dilemma, and I imagine it probably has been here as well. And that's actually come across and underneath some dynamics that have been already going for some time. So we've gone in Australia from being what was, say, 50 years ago an acknowledged Christian society to what was a non-Christian society a decade or two ago, to what I think most of us would have perceived to be an un-Christian society today, where if you are going to be a committed Christian, then don't talk about it too much in the bus or the train, because it'll end the conversation. And particularly if you're a Christian leader, try and get around that, because the conversation will end. We're not particularly well regarded as Christians today in our society. But then there's the dilemma within churches themselves and within Christian faith in Australia today. And I would suggest to you that discipleship is at least struggling, probably fractured. And can I just say one summary sentence there? I think if Jesus was to address us today the way he did, say, the churches in Revelation, he might say something like, from where I started you off, how did we get to where we are today? Now, I don't have time to go into that, but you might want to ask me about what I see as the major dilemmas. How did we get to church and discipleship as consumerist, as looking at KPIs primarily, etc., etc.? And I'm not saying that KPIs are unimportant. Okay. So, and if you want a reference resource, I go back about 10 or even 11 or 12 years now to a publication from the Christian Research Association entitled All Melbourne Matters. Now, I realise in raising Melbourne here, I'm not going to be too popular, but All Melbourne Matters was a study, a very well-compiled study by Dr. Hughes and a few other people, and it looked at churches in the metropolitan area of Melbourne. I'll just give you a couple of snippets of it to show you the tenor of what that's about. It basically, from the statistics that were there, if you extrapolated them out at the rate of decline of church attendance, and this is dated, so it's back 12 or 13 years. I'm not sure too much has changed. It may have gone up a little bit. But if you extrapolate out, there will be nobody going to church by the year 2070 in Melbourne, total metropolitan area. Now, that's not going to happen, but that was the level of decline in church attendance at that time, and I'm not sure that too much has changed. So that leaders become extremely discouraged under the present situation of the tide going out. And if you or I are in any way significantly wedded to linking our effectiveness as a leader to performance and outcomes and KPIs, then most of us will be incredibly discouraged. One of the questions that I ask in mentoring is, are there any things that you would like to share with me before I just run through my template of how you're going in 5 particular areas of a 360-degree checkup? And the most often expressed things that leaders talk to me about from their own initiative is how discouraged they're feeling by people having left their church recently who they thought were rusted on, were part of the family, had been invested in by the leadership team, etc. And not only are they leaving to go to supposedly a better church, but they're leaving with a parting shot of criticism, or you're not the best at children's or youth or worship or facilities or whatever. You don't match up, so we're on our way. So there's a strong level of encouragement needed for Christian leaders today. So the dilemma within church and within leadership, and I'm talking still about the context of going deeper to go further, is actually stressing leaders and particularly pastors out today. The issue of leadership seems to me, and this is where you might want to question me more closely, it seems to me as if, as far as Christian leadership and the biblical understanding of leadership, with good intention and really quite a lot of energy and intellectual capacity, we've failed to keep the main game as the main game. Now, I'm going to say quite a bit more about this in a few minutes' time, but just to give you a heads up, one of the things that I've become very convinced about is that something can be very good, but if you place it in the position of being the main game or essential, it's not able to actually effectively undertake that role. So that I would say church growth has had a great deal of influence on ministry and on leadership over the past almost 50 years now, and that it's had many very positive impacts. But if you place church growth as the major paradigm for your leadership, I'm sorry, it doesn't have the gravitas to actually fulfill that role. It's a little bit like a person being promoted to the level of their incompetence. You know the Peter Principle, where people who are excellent teachers, because they're excellent teachers, they get promoted to a leadership and a management role, and it brings them undone, and they don't do a good job because actually the competence for teaching is quite different from, and maybe the promotion has not actually been appropriate. So I think we've had a series of promotions of factors that are good to almost carrying the day as the most important thing for leaders to do, and the Guernsey is good, but it's not the main game. With a little bit of trepidation, I would say to you, another one that I think has gotten a Guernsey that's been extremely helpful and good, but I'm quite concerned about at the moment if it takes the main role, and that is the Pentecostal leadership model. Now, I thank God for the fact that in recent years we've been allowed and encouraged to lead. I can tell you that in my college training, 4 years, it didn't compute to me at all that I was training as a leader and to be a leader. And I remember I was in my second local church ministry, and I was at a church growth seminar where the leader was talking about the pastor being a leader, and I turned to my elders and said to them, "Do you see me as a leader?" And they said, "Undoubtedly." That was the first time I ever considered that the role of pastor was actually leader. Now, I've come to believe very firmly that pastor is one of the key qualifications for being a Christian leader, that you have a pastoral heart. But Peterson has helped me to draw two other biblical concepts, biblical words into my understanding of what leadership actually is. And you could do a bit of a study on this if you like. Peterson has helped me again because in his translation, or as some people call it, a paraphrase, Peterson was an outstanding Greek and Hebrew scholar. He didn't have the committee behind him in the same way as some of the other versions, and you need to check up on it, but if he gets it right, it's very powerful because it puts it in the language that I understand and most of the people can understand. But he translates three Greek words as leader. One is pastor, the other is the Greek word for maturity, and the third is the Greek word for authority. Now, I love that combination of capacities or qualifications for Christian leadership, so that a Christian leader is a mature disciple. And again, I just suggest to you that the biblical picture of leadership is primarily mature discipleship. And if you look at 1 Timothy 3 and Titus, the picture of the elder or the leader, because Peterson translates that eldership as leader, you will find that they are overwhelmingly who the person is rather than what the person does. So that in actual fact, there is a picture of mature, pastorally sensitive, designated authority. So we set aside people as leaders who are mature disciples with a pastoral heart in order to lead other disciples towards maturity. And if we go away from the basic qualification for Christian leadership being mature discipleship, I think we've put something else as the main game rather than formation or character development. So you can see where I'm heading, can't you? And this is where the book is heading, because under Sarah's tutelage, I'm gradually working out, not only is burnout an indication that leaders need more support, more resourcing to go deeper, but actually there's a much deeper malaise than just burnout. And it seems as if it's a malaise about leadership, and it is, but when you dig a little deeper, it's actually about discipleship. So that I've now come to see that in my mentoring of Christian leaders, it's basically discipleship 101 or 201 or 301, because it's about helping the leader to not only do the right thing, because coaching is inevitably a part of mentoring, but the main issue is who the person is, because what they do comes out of who they are. And I love something that Peter McHugh taught me many years ago when we taught a course together called Leading from Deep Places for ACOM. And Peter McHugh taught me that Christian discipleship and leadership is acceptance and security in the love and grace of God before but not without performance for God. Okay? So that our formation, the development of the nature and the capacities of Jesus within our life through the work of the Holy Spirit, that formation is the main game for discipleship. And that out of that main game of maturing discipleship, we find the capacities for effective, ongoing, sustainable leadership. So one of the things that I suggest to you is that we have quite rightly placed emphasis on knowledge, biblical knowledge, for effective ministry. That's really important. We've placed emphasis more and more, and I welcome this, on giftedness, on excellence, on doing things well and having outcomes that are obvious and quantifiable and whatever. But very little emphasis in training, at least, and very little encouragement once we are out in the field on the whole area of formation, on the whole area of who we are in God. So that my educated guess from the years of mentoring with Christian leaders would be that at least as much of the dilemma and stress of being in Christian leadership, and particularly pastoral leadership today, is a result of my and your reaction to the dilemmas and the stresses, as much as what the actual stresses are. And that how we respond, whether it's defensive or aggressive, actually is very important in terms of outcomes and how effective the ministry then in an ongoing way is. So that not only would I say to you that Christian formation is not actually Christian if it doesn't have an on-the-ground impact. So the idea that we're so heavenly to be of no earthly use is not Christian spirituality. So that if Christian spirituality is deeper and deeper in us, it will affect primarily who we are in our own security. That is a major issue, security in the love and freedom in the grace of God. And those two key capacities, the love providing the personal security, and insecurity is my deepest dilemma, and I believe for most of us it's our deepest dilemma. We need unconditional love, otherwise we can't hold our heads up. You know, the imposter syndrome is alive and well in us. We don't feel up to it. So we have to put some runs on the board in order to feel okay. And what I have now come to believe is, instead of me trying to put runs on the board by running so hard, which is why I burnt out, a better way of going about it is to actually have a personal security that knows that because of God's love and grace through Jesus, I am okay. I can lift my head up, I can be secure, because nothing can separate me from the love of God. Romans 8, absolutely nothing. And if that sinks deep within my heart and my soul, then actually as a result of that, I will change from the inside out, and my relationships will change. So that if you have a look at, say, the fruit of the Spirit, which I would tend to see as the epitome of the character change that God can bring to us as disciples and as leaders. It's just a picture, and you'll find the same sort of picture in some of the other epistles, like in Colossians chapter 3, you'll see a fairly similar kind of picture of what happens in the life of the disciple if we are maturing through the fruit of the Spirit as expressed in Galatians 5:22 and 23. The same kind of picture of inside out formation that allows us to be different people, and particularly those 1 Timothy 3 Titus pictures are inside out. It starts inside me. It's then most evident or not evident in my home with my wife, and if you have children at home, with your children. Then it goes to the church, and then it goes to the community. You know, notice that there's actually almost concentric circles in both Timothy and Titus. And I used to think that there were no performance orientations at all in those pictures, but maybe apt to teach might be, although my understanding now of that is willing to give a reason for the hope that is within us. So it's much more about sensitive, caring, effective witness than it is about, you know, the dynamic of being a brilliant teacher or whatever. So again, it comes back to who we are. So I have to confess that I bear some responsibility for this, what I see that we have in the West overlooked the main game in discipleship and therefore in Christian leadership. And I'm a little bit confused or a little bit perplexed as to where you start with this or what comes first. I'm talking to you as Christian leaders because I think that's fantastic. This is a very important consciousness raising, maybe, leverage, maybe, to have us take more seriously these kinds of issues. But actually they are not leadership issues, they are discipleship issues. So where do we start? Do we start by changing to some extent and having the gravitas of formation as leaders and therefore helping disciples to grow more effectively? Or do we just start with a different approach to what discipleship involves and therefore grow more effective leaders? I'm not sure about that. Probably I think God might start at discipleship, but for us there's a good leverage point in terms of our own leadership going deeper in order to go further. How am I going for time? 15. Okay. So that leads me to hone in on this whole issue of going deeper to go further. I need to make a confession almost, an apology almost, for talking about Christian spirituality because I've never been a particularly spiritual person. I've got my twin brother here today and he can vouch for that. I nearly killed him when we were growing up. I asked my mum, she's passed away now, but I asked her a few years ago, so what are you most grateful about in terms of us growing up as your children and as your boys? And without any hesitation, she said, I'm just so thankful that neither of you killed the other. In other words, it was a pretty rugged show. There wasn't much. I never went anywhere near any Christian group at school. At any university course I ever did, I never went anywhere near any of the Christian groups because I used to go to a Christian camp or whatever and be incredibly challenged and get a guilty conscience. So I'd start my quiet times again and be like running a mower into long grass. It'd soon choke and then I'd be out and go to the next kind of pep up or talk or consciousness raising or conscience raising thing, and never. So I can't believe that I'm talking to you about spirituality, but can I say again to you, if this doesn't have relational and personal gravity to it, it's not Christian. So in actual fact, it's about love, joy, peace, patience, gentleness, meekness, humility, self-control. They are the key qualities, and note that they are universally accepted virtues. So what this means is that if they are growing in our lives, then we will be more winsome to the outside world. Did you realise that they don't like us very much? Did you? They don't. Some time ago, some research was done by McCredden, and you may have read this. It's a few years ago now, but I think it's still valid. And it was the key belief blockers to Australian people opening themselves to the possibility that they would become a Christian. Belief blockers. Do you know the 3 top belief blockers? They were not about anything to do with Christian doctrine. That's a bit surprising. Abuse? Yes, definitely. Particularly leader abuse was the number 1 belief blocker. Hypocrisy? Very close to it. That they see us as not actually following through on what we express as being Christian. And they're all fairly closely related, I think. The third was judgmentalism. That they see us actually, whenever we speak publicly, it's more likely to be some censure of our community standards or whether. So they hear us belly aching a lot in a judgmental way that does not attract people to us. Now, I have a picture of the New Testament church along with the incredible vitality of community and people becoming Christian. It says in Acts 2 and Acts 5, something like, and people liked what they saw. Or in Acts chapter 5 it says, people were wary about joining them, but they liked what they saw. Now, I like that combination. Wary about joining them because this is a big commitment. It's a countercultural. To become a disciple of Jesus is very counterintuitive and countercultural. So you better think very much before you give yourself to it. But once you do, then this lifestyle is actually attractive. So I just wonder whether our inability with respect to mission or evangelism comes out of our flawed discipleship. Part of that All Melbourne Matters documentation indicated that for Melbourne churches, 2.5 people per church per year became Christian. 2.5 people per church per year. I'm not sure that it's turned the corner. And I just wonder how much of that is not because we're not concerned about witness. It's not because every church doesn't have an outreach. It's actually more because they don't like the product all that much. And therefore, discipleship in its brokenness is actually a major dilemma with respect to our mission, because we're struggling in both discipleship and mission in the Western world. Not in many other parts of the world, praise God, but certainly within the Western society. So I've now come to believe that emotional depletion is a symptom that needs to be taken notice of and addressed, but it's only a symptom. And I'm now believing, and I must admit, and I hesitate to tell Sarah this, Sarah Whitehead, but I've been writing since the book was finished, because you'll notice if you are able to read it that it basically finishes on just an outline of what it means to have a character-based leadership as a primary qualification for leadership. And I've written quite a bit more about that, asking the question, why? What is character-based leadership? How do you get it? What might be some of the perceived and able to be discerned outcomes of effective character-based leadership? And I believe that character-based leadership is potentially the number one issue to be addressed in Western society and Australia today, because it's character of leaders that is coming undone at a very significant level and rate at the moment. And I'm very sad to say that. And I'm not sure how much to say or not say about this kind of issue, but I'm in a privileged position, having privileged knowledge of a fairly wide range of leaders across a fairly wide range of Christianity in Australia. And what we have seen that has hit the headlines fairly recently, and this might be an exaggeration, I pray, Lord, this is only the tip of the iceberg. I'm sorry. But some of the leadership models across the whole of Christendom, whether it be from the authoritarian model of the traditional, more structured churches, you know, the Roman Catholic Church and so forth, right through the middle, where we probably as basically Churches of Christ, Baptists, right through to the Pentecostal movement. I have concerns about the whole issue of abuse and of what the model of leadership that is espoused most highly actually is. I've already indicated to you that I love the fact that what I call the anointed leader model from the Pentecostals has permeated into the mainline denominations. We were in big trouble before that because, and here I need to say to you, I don't accept from a biblical perspective that the church is a democracy. I believe we need to include people in and listen and have good ears and whatever, but we cannot be governed or led by the lowest common denominator or by the majority. That's one end of the scale where I think we have gradually been blessed by a stronger leadership model. But I wouldn't be honest with you if I didn't say to you that I'm concerned at the moment about some of the extremities at the other end of the scale which have to do with authoritarianism and celebrity. They are not part of the godly model for leadership. Either authoritarianism, which is a dictatorial approach to leadership, which doesn't listen, which doesn't have pastoral sensitivity, but still has hopefully some vision to allow for the church to be outreaching and get out of our comfort zone. But wherever any theme of celebrity or of authoritarianism comes in, it might go well for a while, and particularly with extremely gifted communicators, it may be effective even in evangelism for some period of time. But what I've come to believe is that people will follow giftedness for a season, they will follow character for a lifetime. Can I say that again? People will follow giftedness for a season, but they will follow character, Jesus, and who he is. And if the fruit of the Spirit are replicated in our lives, and I don't find any, in principle, problem with Paul, and one of the translations of 1 Corinthians 11 verse 1 is Paul saying, follow me as I follow Christ. Okay, that's not a self-centered, that's not putting ourselves up. That's saying from Paul, he was modelling himself on Jesus, and the fruit of the Spirit were coming in his life, and therefore people could use a modelling of our leadership to actually find the nature of God and what it means to be a mature Christian disciple. So I'm hoping and praying that actually we are working out before it becomes absolutely crucial that the leadership model that abuses or is dictatorial and doesn't, as well as having vision and modelling outreach and effective community and whatever, that doesn't have the capacity to wash somebody's stinking feet is not the biblical and the Jesus model. And unless we recapture that in our Western world as a discipleship model to provide mature Christian leadership, I think we will continue to be in some trouble. But we are at least at the point of turning the corner at the moment. There are many, many green shoots. And if I wrote the book today, I could add significantly to the green shoots that you find in the last chapter. And I'm finding, therefore, that what I'm actually just getting on a bandwagon, I think. I'm joining a bandwagon that I believe is actually gathering momentum, but needs to be fully embraced by present leaders in order to model effective Jesus leadership, which will then very much affect discipleship. And if you want to know what I'm worried about discipleship, be as radical as you possibly can be, because Jesus was. You can't serve two masters. You can't serve God and the bank, is the way Peterson expresses Luke 16. You can't serve God and the bank. Now, that doesn't mean the bank's bad. That doesn't mean whatever else is not to be valued and even addressed. But if you put it in the main role, you know, I am reminded personally regularly that in Jesus' communication with one of the churches in Revelation, he said, I'd rather you were cold than lukewarm. I'd rather you were either hot or cold rather than lukewarm, because being lukewarm, being halfway, makes me sick. And I'm sensing that that's the impact of half-warm Christianity on the community as a whole. That if we were totally committed as disciples, if we were radical Christians, and there's no possibility of becoming counterproductive in our society if you're a radical Christian, because love and grace are the two key messages. And it's about joy and peace and patience and self-control. So if it's anything other than that, it's not Christian spirituality. So God's challenge to me and to you is be radical. Let's go all the way in terms of following Jesus, because the outcome of that isn't where somebody's going to become a bomber or anything like that. It'll be in the opposite direction, and people will look at it and say, wow, I think that might be the way to live. That might be what I've been looking for all of my life. going deeper to go further comes out of the need. I'm a messy person. Can I hazard a guess that you're a messy person? I need help. I mean it when I say I'm a messy person. I'm self-centred. These days there's only 2 of us live in the house, but it's still not fair. What we need is to be loved and accepted and forgiven and to live in grace, so that the best antidote for my performance orientation, and believe you me, I come from a DNA that would be hard to think of anybody more performance oriented. Now, other people might challenge that, but I'm sure my brother doesn't. I'm sure the people who know me best don't. I'm a very competitive person. I don't think it was by upbringing, because my mum and dad were never pushing us. But the way I played sport, etc., a dead giveaway. So we're addressing us as we are, and I find in even the intimate and organic is the way in which I like to think of my relationship with God through Jesus. There's a personal relationship and it's growing, and it's needed almost every moment of every day because I mess up. And I'm performance oriented and I feel terrible and I need to repent until I then realise, hang on, I can start again. So I love this good news that says, hang on, we're all messy. Family is messy. We live in mess. But there's redemption. So if we could just live with the humility of the reality of the need for redemption and humility, I think we might have some good news that not only applies to us and allows us to be good models, but allows other disciples to grow and allows the people out there to say, I think there might be something in that. Okay. Any questions?
Yeah. Thank you, Keith. Am I on? Not on? Yep. Thanks, Keith. Questions? I have one to start with. You used the phrase emotional depletion, and that's what you were constantly, through your mentoring with various leaders, finding that there was this sense of real emotional depletion. Can you just maybe unpack that a little bit? But also, what's the response to that? Like, okay, so that's there, so how do we, not really fix, but how do we respond to that?
Okay, yeah. Neil, you'll have to, can you give me 5 minutes and tell me when 5 minutes is up for that?
Yes.
Because I could easily talk for 25 minutes about that.
Well, don't, but
no.
do 5.
Okay,
yeah.
so very quickly, let's start with the emotional part of us, the feeling part of us. From a Christian perspective, I accept fully what I was taught a long time ago, and that is go for the truth, don't go for feelings. Okay, feelings are fickle. Go for the truth. I remember a Lay Institute for Evangelism tract. On the back it had a train, and it had put fact in the engine and feelings in the guard's van. Okay, so I accept that fully. Feelings are fickle, but do you know how important the emotional part of our life is to every other part? If our emotions are depleted or in some way there is great pain, it will affect every other part of our lives. And if you are emotionally depleted, for instance, you'll find it very difficult to pray, because emotional depletion is about motivation. And therefore you won't have a motivation to get up and go for anything, including spirituality. Relationships will suffer incredibly if you are emotionally depleted. The kind of model or figure of speech that I find helpful when it comes to thinking about emotions is a tank. And just as we have physical capacity, we have intellectual capacity. And if you run a marathon, you're going to have to recuperate from that, and you won't be able to run a marathon straight away again because you're depleted. You need to recover. So also with our emotions. We have an emotional tank, an emotional resource that if it's not healthy, if more has gone out of the tank than has come in to the tank, it will get to a level where we begin to have some of the symptoms of emotional depletion and some of the symptoms of burnout. Now, burnout is a recognised stress-related, mostly vocational dilemma. It's not a mental health issue per se. It's a stress-related, often from vocational underlyings, that if you're giving out more than you are taking in, and particularly over a period of time, and you begin to run low in your emotional tank, you will experience symptoms that are indicative of a low emotional tank. Things like, and some of these are very prevalent in other dilemmas as well, so it's you have to have a generic approach to this to understand how it differs from, say, depression or some other dilemmas. If you begin to avoid people, then that's a pretty good idea that your emotional tank, some of us as introverts are pretty good at that anyway, but I've found that even the most extreme extrovert, I've got to be careful. I preached at a church, 2 services, needed to talk to the senior pastor between services, couldn't find him, found him locked in his office upstairs because he couldn't do the foyer between services. He's in at least the orange zone, probably worse, because he's staying away from people. So our closest people, spouse, children, will probably notice first. The crucial issue, and being tetchy, having a short fuse, not as able to concentrate. Some people say there are 3 major indicators of burnout. One is what's called depersonalisation, staying away from people. The second is that you have a diminishing of your effectiveness, of your capacity to concentrate, so that, for instance, you can't read a book as well without your mind wandering and so forth. And it has an impact on who we are as people, because we just don't have the motivation to get up and go, not only for relationships and performance, but to witness or to be a leader or whatever. So what I suggest is that people monitor fairly carefully whether they have even the early signs of burnout. And burnout is probably most likely to occur amongst the most committed and potentially even the most able leaders. It tends to strike surreptitiously. It's death by 1,000 cuts. It strikes surreptitiously in people who have been in ministry for at least 10 years, and you are most at risk if you've been in the same church for at least that long. So that, and I can talk about some people because they've become public. A classic example, and he's been good enough to write in the book, of a orange zone for burnout is Mark Connor. Some of you will know of Mark. Of my people whom I have mentored in Australia, and this is no denigration of any other leader, Mark is the best all-round Christian leader I have ever met, including in areas of formation. He has a very strong Christian character. Mark was right on the edge of burnout at least a couple of times. Mark was actually the first person to ever ask me to mentor him, and I was flabbergasted and said no. And when he asked me why, I said, well, I couldn't do what you do, so how can I? He said, I'm not looking for a coach, I'm looking for a mentor. What does that mean? I'm looking for somebody for who I am rather than what I do. Well, what's your problem there? I'm in meetings at the moment that I normally really love, and I often chair them and I can help them to come to the outcomes that are really exciting. And at the moment I'm looking at my watch and I'm saying, when is this thing going to be over? I don't want to be here. And when he said that, I smelt burnout. I'd been there. I smelt it. So it's the melody of potentially the most effective, the most committed leaders. Lazy people basically don't burn out. So Satan has devised in a very cunning way how he's getting under the radar of very effective leaders and getting them before they even realise what. And the demands on Christian leadership today. I mean, I was trained and ministered for at least a decade on the pastor-teacher model. That's all it took. And I was leading a significant church in Sydney on the pastor-teacher model, so that I would pastorally care and I would preach and I would teach and whatever. And that's all that was. I attended an elders meeting and a board meeting. That's about all. And I just taught. And then church growth. Then Pentecostal leadership models. Then the church becomes an enterprise. And we have to be a CEO as well as a pastor and a leader. And how do you do that? Anyway, so
what's the response? So how do we respond to that? Like, how do we, like, when we figure out that maybe we get a few signs that we're burning out or in the orange zone, what do we need to do, and what does the church, what do our leaders need to recognise? What do our leaders need to put in place?
Okay, they're interrelated, but they're separate.
So 2 minutes.
Yes.
2 minutes.
Okay.
Summary.
The first thing that we need to do is, one, recognise that this is a significant present dilemma. And I have a question in mentoring. It is, out of 10, how full is your emotional tank at the moment? 10 is, I can't wait to get out of bed every morning. Life is good. Ministry is good. I've never been a 10, and I don't think I've ever had anybody tell me they're 10. Okay? Naught is, sometimes I can't get out of bed. Literally, it's too hard. The day's too hard. And you would possibly be surprised at how often that actually is true. And very recently, I have had somebody say to me, at a particular time, I literally couldn't get out of bed. So that is definitely in some kind of deficit there. 5 is, I can get out of bed most days, if not always, but I just hope and pray that nobody even looks sideways at me or doesn't look at me when I think they have not acknowledged me. Because I can get into a spiral of negative self-talk that has me down at a naught before I know where I am, and it's then labelled a bad day. Okay, so I'm quite vulnerable. Steve Smith, a previous principal of ACOM, about 4 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, had an inventory, a research project, mainly Baptist Churches of Christ, pastors, I think about 200 people did the inventory. I snuck that question into his inventory, and the average that the pastors fed back for their present, when they answered that questionnaire, was 5.5. 5.5 is not good. That's at least the orange zone. That's the average of pastors in Churches of Christ Baptists fairly recently. So we need to recognise what drains us and what energises us and become good stewards of those resources so that we're aware, and one of the fruit of the Spirit, self-control or self-discipline, kicks in, and we order our lives as a high priority on making sure that we are in healing, redress, recuperation mode sufficiently often and powerfully to keep us above that orange zone. So we're aware of the key drainers. All conflict is incredibly draining for most people, and if you are not drained by conflict, come and see me afterwards because you're in trouble. I don't mean that. There's at least 2 people here who you should see before you see me. So I'll refer you to them because they are present clinicians. But that is a dilemma. If you get off on conflict, I'm sorry, but that's peacemaker is part of the fruit of the Spirit. To be able in your weekly diary and priorities, in your monthly priorities, in your yearly priorities, and in your 7 yearly priorities, because we're bringing sabbatical into play here, Sabbath, rest, which we've neglected and needs to be a part of the created rhythm of God in all people, all His creation. It's in the land, it's in all of His creation. Read Leviticus 25. The universities, when the churches ran the universities, they brought in sabbatical leave. The universities have kept it and we've let it go. So have a replenishment and talk to your leaders. I love the opportunity regularly, well, semi-regularly, where, say, a leader is considering Sabbath or sabbatical leave, and the leader will say to me, would you come to my elders and just talk to them about this biblical principle and how I can stay, or we can stay, more healthy if we just are more attentive to these kinds of in-out factors and bring them on side in this whole issue of having the governance group, the elders or however you like to call them, having as one of their major agenda items, how are you going? How are you travelling? So that they recognise the health and vitality of the leadership is one of God's key strategies for effective discipleship building and mission. And if the health of the leader is impaired, or leaders are impaired in any significant way, the potential for derailment of all momentum within the life of the church or of the ministry is very real.
That's a great answer. That's exactly what I was looking for.
Okay.
Okay, has anyone else got a question? Okay. Shout. Oh, okay. All right.
Keith, you said that you've seen that pastoral ministry is becoming increasingly complex, I think, something like that. So just wondering what you meant by that. Is it society's expectations of pastors, or churches' expectations, or the pastors themselves' expectations, or what is it about this increasing complexity that you see?
I think that I'd reiterate that it's about keeping the main thing, in that we have been derailed or at least sidetracked by very good other emphases like church growth, like a more vision-oriented approach to leadership that allows visionary leadership rather than democracy. And incidentally, I've got a few resources about sabbatical leave, and I've got one little document that is called The Perfect Storm for Emotional Depletion. Anybody who wants to contact me, my email address is keith.marg@bigpond.com. I can make available to you any resources that I presently have, and maybe even somebody might agree to be the person who collates that so that it's not just a individualistic thing. But there's brief documents on sabbatical leave, the key emotional depleters for, I call it the perfect storm for emotional depletion in ministry, practical principles and practice of sabbatical leave, those kinds of things. To come back to your question, I think initially we recognised that church growth was teaching us that we don't just want to talk to ourselves. We want to make sense to the community and therefore lead well. Then Pentecostal movement allowed us to see that we need to be more vital in our get-togethers, and they need to be times of rejoicing and praise, because church was very boring when I grew up. It was terrible. It was enough to put anybody off, I think. But you know, at least we got our vitality back into our coming together. Of more recent days, there's been the challenge of mission. How do you do mission effectively? And I think in all good intention and conscience, we've added on to what we do as churches what I called enterprises. So that, for instance, the church that Marg and I are organically involved in, Coast Community Church on the Central Coast of New South Wales, fantastic church. Our last two pastors have at least been in the orange zone of Burnout, and they're fantastic people, good long-term leaders, really good people. And I say to myself and I say to others, how could that happen? Our church, with all good intention and conscience, now runs a school and has for the last probably 20, 25 years. We have preschool, we have a cafe, we have a significant care ministry to the whole of our area. So if you are called to the senior pastor role, you basically need to become the CEO of an enterprise. And it's a little bit like, I was called to ministry, I trained to be a pastor teacher, I trained in order to be able to help people to go deeper, to go further. I didn't do a management course when I trained, or nobody talked to me about how to do a financial drive, because now the key financial well-being of the church rests on how well I present the stewardship campaign. And you've got no idea how many of the people I'm alongside are just drained incredibly. They're good at it often, but when the stewardship campaign is over and they know they've reached the target, there's just an incredible weight off their shoulders. So it's almost like as if we've made it more. Now, I'm not saying the church shouldn't do that, but we've got to devise a way where the pastor and the teacher, the leader in terms of going deeper to go further, is not taken up with. Like, I've mentored fantastic Christian leaders who needed to become the chairperson of the school board because there was a derailing happening there, that it was going to become counterproductive and whatever. And therefore, for maybe 5 years, a significant part of their time and energy, it wasn't wasted in any way, it was valuable, but do we make sure now that we're keeping from a spiritual formation, character development, the main thing? So I don't have a definitive answer, but I think we're gradually beginning to realise what's been happening from good intentions, but they've gradually drawn us aside to something much more complicated than what we were initially called to.
Great. One more question? Surely there's one there.
Hi, Keith. How well are we going at equipping the actual church? You know, like with all the events and the performances and the things you've been talking about, is there, in your experience, do you see the church being equipped individuals?
Yes. The question is, how well are we going in terms of, as churches, equipping our disciples? This would be a situation where I'm very encouraged by the resources and the intentional emphasis on discipleship that many significant movements are embracing now. If I can, some of you will be aware of Crossway Baptist Church in Melbourne, and their leadership is now strongly committed to something that came out of the kind of Breen thing initially from England and then from America, that hones in very strongly on discipleship and on key elements of what I would say is going deeper, to go intimate organic relationship with God, and therefore being what I remember from a book that I read probably 60 years ago, becoming a one-thinger, this one thing I know, helping people to go deeper, still having many other aspects, good aspects to their lives, but not having their faith as an add-on, having their faith as the essence, and other areas fall into line with what those key beliefs and principles and values are. So that it seems to me as if one of the challenges for us as disciples today is about values. What do we value most? What would we die for? And I think, don't die for very many things. One of the things that I mentor, I say, be careful what you'll die for, because I've known a lot of leaders who have died for things that then it's not worth dying for. Don't get up on the table at the elders' meeting and swear your head off about something that's incidental. That guy died. His ministry died that day, unfortunately, and it wasn't worth dying for. So be careful what you'll die for, but when you work out, as Jesus encourages us to, that this is the way to gain life to the full, and you're going for it, and you're encouraging. So I'm very encouraged. I just give Crossway as an example because I find, and there's several leaders here whom I'm eyeballing at the moment who I think in their leadership across denominations and networks are recognising how important this is. And I had a couple whom I mentor are state leaders of ACC. And the last time I mentored with them, the guy said to me, you know what COVID's helped me to realise? COVID has helped me to realise that the events-driven model of church is never going to produce passionate followers of Jesus. I could hardly believe what I was hearing him say. I mean, you're the best in the world at it. That's what you've majored on, and it's paid dividends up until now. And now you're recognising it's about a deeper discipleship. If that actually catches on, we're going to be in much better shape for the future.
Okay, I'm going to maybe take one more question. The fellow at the back up there.
Thank you. Wow. You've just put your finger on something that I planned to say and should have said. The major value change and capacity to perform, to make that a reality of going deeper to go further is very straightforward. It's getting the centre of gravity from me to God. That's what it's all about. Getting the centre of gravity from me to God and then to my neighbour. That's spirituality. That's what going deeper is all about. That's what redemption is about. That's what the good news is about. So that the underlying theme in all of this is, and you'll forgive me if I get a bit passionate here and start to yell a bit. I cannot work out for the life of me why we have not emphasised much more the work of the Holy Spirit inside us, changing us from self-centeredness to God-centeredness. I get that it's important to talk about the gifts of the Spirit, that's great, but it's much more important to embrace the fruit of the Spirit. You remember in Corinthians, I think it's 2 Corinthians, at the end of it, Paul says, without the resurrection, we're goners. Let's give up. We're playing games. Let's just acknowledge it and say, we've been fooled. I would say, and this is where, I say this, I hope, humbly, I would say, if we don't recognise that the work of the Spirit of God within us is the main game in terms of both discipleship and mission, and we put anything else up, then it's as equally as disastrous as if we don't believe in the resurrection. And therefore we've got to bring back formation with visible outcomes in relationships and performance in terms of the fruit of the Spirit on the ground. We've got to recognise that our belief is good and our giftedness is good, but they are actually not the main game.
Great. I'm going to flip things a little bit. So I'm going to get you to do one more thing, and that is just to maybe make a few comments about partners in ministry. Oh, yeah. Emily's just stepped out, but I might get Dave just to say where that's at with WA, just for a minute or so. And then I might then hand over to Mark because we're going to launch the book, and then we'll finish with morning tea, with afternoon tea, and hopefully you can all grab a copy of the book. So if you can give where things are at, make your comment about Partners in Ministry.
How long?
A minute or two.
2 minutes, okay. I've expanded from 1 to 2.
1 minute. 1 minute.
2 minutes. In recent years, I've become aware of a group called Partners in Ministry. I don't know very much about their history, but basically this is a interdenominational, primarily involved in the evangelical Pentecostal leadership world, that has the stated desire to support, encourage and resource Christian leaders more effectively. It's coming out of some Christian foundations, Christian business people who have thankfully worked out that leaders are struggling and that leadership is absolutely vital. And therefore Partners in Ministry are committed to building a group of partners who are available across Australia for mentoring, coaching, pastoral supervision, spiritual formation, retreating, a whole range of supports and encouragements for leaders that will allow leadership to be more effective. I'm in the process of actually linking myself with Partners in Ministry, because some of you may know at the end of this year I'm going to conclude mentoring on a contract basis. So I'm still going to be available for what we call conversations, one-off conversations, but I feel really sad when I even say it, but I've got to decide at some stage. What I love is there's going to be, wherever I've been able to mentor in Australia, there's going to be a bank of very well resourced, trained and supported coaches, mentors, pastoral supervisors, spiritual advisors, retreat leaders who are available right across particularly the evangelical and the Pentecostal world, and I thank God for that.
It's great. Dave, it's about to launch here. Can you just a minute or so?
As Keith said, it's across Australia, and I start on Friday. Emily started 3 weeks ago. Emily had to go, but so we're working in WA, but obviously with Zoom and all that sort of stuff, you're not held to a location. But Keith, how many of you been mentoring?
When? At the moment?
At the moment.
Oh, probably about 75.
So it's come down from about 150. So Keith has been doing it 17 and a half years, and basically there's probably 25 to 30 who are now doing it around Australia. So so we're available. I'm available if you want to chat more. I'd love to chat more about the possibilities. God bless you.
Okay, so each state that we've been launching Keith's book in, Keith's nominated someone that he's been mentoring over many years, and here in WA, he's asked me to ask Mark Wilson to launch the book. So I'm going to ask Mark to come up, speak to the book, and thanks.
That's great. I feel like this is volume 1. What do you reckon? I think we need volume 2 coming out pretty soon. You've got a lot to say, Keith, which is really good, actually. And I don't know whether you recorded today or not, but yeah, hopefully you did, because I'm sure that'll be of great value. But I did want to say it's an absolute privilege to be able to do this today for you, Keith, here in WA. Keith's been my mentor since 2005. And I've appreciated every part of that you've done for me. Keith started out really as a pastor, then did psychology, principal and teacher at a theological college, and then probably, in some ways, probably the pinnacle of your ministry has been your mentoring of leaders around Australia. And many of the people in this room have actually had the experience of that and enjoyed that, which has just been absolutely magnificent. Your influence as a pastor has influenced my life. As a pastor, as a leader, as a husband, as a father, and now, yes, a grandfather, absolutely has been really important. You're one of the fathers of the faith in Australia, and I hope that you'll continue to write and speak and do the things that you've been doing, because we need people like you. Don't you agree? We do. You are humble. I noticed when we came in today, did you see where the chairs were? And what did Keith want to do? Bring them down and be at the same level. Not that there's anything significant, but there actually is. Keith's actually a humble leader. Not only is he humble, but he's very insightful, he's kind, compassionate, a visionary, a teacher and a mentor, and now an author as well. So I want to say the book here, and it's available at the back, Going Deeper to Go Further, will be of great value to anybody who reads it. I've had a great read of it, and it's fantastic. On a personal level, in 2007, my wife and I went through a really difficult time in our marriage. And remember how I said to you, I started having mentoring from Keith in 2005, and that was over some grief and all sorts of stuff like that. And I remember going to Keith and asking his help. So he moved from being my mentor and then becoming my counsellor, actually becoming our counsellor. And Karen and I, even to this day, would say how thankful we are to you for the way that you helped us now in our 37th year of marriage, loving life, loving ministry, and just love doing what we can for Jesus. What you've spoken about today about character-based leadership resonates deep within my heart, and you and I have talked about that a lot. So thank you for writing this book. I highly recommend it to you. It could save your life. It could save your ministry. It could save your marriage. But most of all, it can save yourself. Thanks very much, Keith.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate that. The book's now launched. It's been an absolute privilege for ACOM to launch this book. And we have your own microphone. It's down there. It's been our privilege to launch it, and we're very thankful, and I'm sure you want to maybe say something about Sarah.
Thank you. Yeah. I just want to thank particularly ACOM, because this book would not be a reality without ACOM. If I can very briefly tell you a story, I was mentoring with a couple whom I love and value, have mentored with them for quite a long period of time, and the lady is a faculty member of ACOM, and somehow or other I must have mentioned that I'd done some writing. And she said, Keith, what writing have you done, and would you be prepared to let me read it? And I said, well, I've done about 20,000 words. It was about burnout. It was about the initial part of the book. And I said to Edwina Blair, yeah, sure, you can read it if you want to. She said, do you know that ACOM has a publishing arm? I said, no, I didn't know that. And then she asked, would you let Steve Smith read it as well? And I said, yeah, sure, anybody can read it. So I met with them about 2 months later, and they both said to me, Keith, we would like to publish it if you would give us permission, but it needs a lot of work. I knew that because I'd written actually before a whole manuscript that when I submitted it to an able person in literary areas, they said exactly the same thing to me. Keith, this is good material, but you'll need to start again, she said. And I said, I'm not starting again. So anything I'd ever written before sank without trace. So I knew there was going to be a problem because I'm not a good writer. That's not one of my gifts. And then Steve said to me, and I believe we've got the ACOM person who can help you. And that's when I was introduced to Sarah. And I could get emotional here because without Sarah, this book would never be, and it would not have the gravitas. If it's got any gravitas at all, and I'm not assuming that it does have, it's Sarah who has put it in the kind of form and flow that allows the argument to... Because the process was, for 18 months, every Wednesday afternoon, Sarah and I would have a FaceTime for about 3/4 of an hour where I would face up to her about the homework that I'd done for her from the previous week, and she would have integrated it into the document, and then she'd give me more homework to do. And I'd say to her, Sarah, you could write that much better than me. And she'd say, I'm not writing anything, Keith. You write it and I'll put it into the kind of process and format that I think people might read it. And every now and then I can remember one week she said to me, Keith, this chapter, which was the biblical chapter about leadership, being mature discipleship, this is the crux to the book, and you haven't nailed it. Oh. She said, you've got to nail it. So I said to her, what do I have to do? And she said, you've got to do this and this and this and this. So that was for 18 months. And talk about giving birth. I mean, it was quite painful. I think I can discern the time when Sarah was up to here. She's very discreet and very magnanimous, but I think both she and her husband had the whole thing. And there was a time when I said to Marg, I'm not sure I want to do this anymore. But thank God we got through. I tried to get Sarah to have dual names on the book, and that's what it should be, because she has not only... She's a lawyer by training, and man, I wouldn't like to be in a rational discussion or dissent with her, but she's very gentle. She has the magnificent capacity, dual capacity, of being intellectually brilliant and rational with a passionate heart, personally and generally, for formation. She's a formation person. So I love that ACOM is giving now significant emphasis to this whole area of training in formation, because I think, and I mentioned earlier, I apologise, I spent 25 years of my life in theological education, and formation was basically left out. Go for it now.
Fantastic. Thank you, Keith. Okay. We're going to be on track for about 4, so a little bit of a chance to grab some afternoon tea, cup of coffee. Make sure you grab a book. They're also available on our ACOM website, so pretty easy to find if you need to duck off, but take advantage of that. Thanks for coming. Appreciate it.